The French defense is a problem for a lot of e4 players. I myself enjoy playing against it, and usually when I face the French, I'm going to play the Tarrasch variation. That's my favorite. Out of all the variations that could happen after one e4, this is probably the one I'm most comfortable with, and I also have an excellent score with it. However, many people struggle to find a good mainline weapon against the French. And people who play the French are used to the Tarrasch, used to knight c3, used to the advanced variation, used to the exchange variation. And having weapons that are rare against the French could be extremely useful. So in this video, I'm going to show you 4 setups you can use against the French that are uncommon, sound, and dangerous for black. Now, one advantage of choosing a sideline over a mainline opening is that you are going to be more prepared than your opponent. So when we play rare variations, it's very likely that our opponent isn't going to be too familiar with it. So today we're going to be looking at 4 different ways to fight the French. We're going to start with pawn to b3 on move 2. That's the Horwitz attack. And this is my favorite. I have sorted them in order of, well, my subjective opinion. And you could say soundness. So pawn to b3 is completely sound and could be devastating for black. Then we're going to continue with queen to e2. This is the so-called Chigorin Variation. This is provocative. It's not, it's not following the classical rules of chess, but it does play against the French very simply because it prevents d5. Because if d5 is played, white has to recapture and black cannot take back with the e6 pawn because it's pinned. So black normally doesn't play d5. And we're going to continue with pawn to c4. Pawn to c4 is the Steiner variation. This leads to extremely dynamic play. If you like isolated queen's pawn positions, this should be your weapon of choice. And you also have the option to transpose to the exchange French at some point if you chicken out. But usually it's going to be an IQP for white, very dynamic play, double-edged, and, black's going to be defending. And then finally, we're going to be looking at the most provocative and the least sound of all 4. When I say least sound, it's still almost equal. Black should have a slight advantage, minus 0.2 or something. La Bourdonnais Variation, which begins with f4. And similarly to the Grand Prix attack or the McDonald attack in the Sicilian, black should respond to this with d5, trying to punish f4. So let's begin. Now, first of all, there are many good ways to fight the French. I'm of the opinion that playing d4 is the best way to go about that. But if you don't feel like studying theory for 6 months, then choosing one of these 4 weapons could benefit you. I should also mention that you can have a look at the King's Indian attack against the French, Bobby Fischer's favorite weapon against the French. I have recently recorded a video on it, a full video on the King's Indian attack. You can check it out. And the King's Indian attack is, in my opinion, equal, but white has much better attacking chances, of course, depending on what black does. So you don't have to go for these sidelines, but having at least one in your repertoire, I think, could be at least a good surprise weapon. Now, I always record videos for tournament players. Playing online, I think, is even better in this case, or using these sidelines will benefit you even more online because people tend to be less prepared. Now let's start with pawn to b3. The Horwitz attack, what's the idea? Well, we are not preventing d5, we are simply playing for the dark squares, and this is similar to the Steiner Sicilian, where you delay your occupation of the center with d4 and play for the dark squares with your bishop. Again, very similar to the Nimzo-Larsen in a sense. So black usually plays d5. If black plays c5, this will transpose to the Steiner variation of the Sicilian defense. So d5, bishop to b2, and now black has a choice. Black can either take the pawn, it's of course a temporary pawn sacrifice by white to play bishop to b2, and that's the most common way to go about it. Black can also play knight f6, or c5. And normally black is going to try to build their French center with pawns on c5, d5, e6, f7. And French defense players are used to playing this, I'm going to call it Tarrasch or Queen's Gambit declined setup, where you have this pawn chain that's very solid, this bishop is bad, and each of the 4 weapons we're going to be looking at is going to try to get black out of their comfort zone by forcing them to change the pawn structure they play. Let me just show you what black is expecting when they play e6. I'll just put the advanced variation on the board. So this is what black is trying to get. Black is comfortable with this. Black knows this. If black doesn't get this, then some people, most people who play the French who aren't well versed in the sidelines are going to be outside of their comfort zone. So bishop to b2. Let's have a look at the main line first. So black takes the pawn. Now we play knight c3, threatening to recapture the pawn. Black is going to defend it with knight f6. I should say that f5 is, according to the engine, fine, but it's really not good. We are going to play f3, offering a full pawn sacrifice. And if this is taken, white has an edge according to the engine, but from a practical standpoint, look at the e5 square. This is a huge hole worth more than a pawn. And after something like bishop d6, for example, there are moves like knight d5. I mean, if knight d5, if this is taken, first of all, bishop g7. So this cannot be taken. After knight d5, let's say knight f6 defending, we can now take, and black is forced to take with the pawn. If black doesn't play knight f6, well, what else? Everything else loses material. So f5 really isn't a good move. The engine says it's black is equal if they play perfect moves afterwards. So if they play f5, just play f3. And they shouldn't take. So after f3, black should continue developing something like bishop d6, and you just take the pawn. And why did black move the f-pawn? There are tricks with queen h4, but this one line, you learn it and then you're fine. g3, bishop takes g3, h takes g3, queen takes h1, and now knight h3. And the queen is misplaced. And again, the engine says equal, but I will take white. You have the exchange, but this is the exchange. Choose either rook. Yeah, so f5, not a good move. Most people will play knight f6. And against this, we go queen e2. So what's the point? We are trying to castle queenside quickly. We are also trying to recapture our pawn. And black has several ways to play, either bishop b4 or bishop e7. Bishop b4 is, I think, a better move. The idea is bishop a3, trying to exchange this very strong bishop after queen e7. So we castle queenside, queen e7. And you could play king b1 and bishop a1. But I believe that taking the pawn is more precise. After bishop a3, you can now take on f6 with check. Of course, this bishop is pinned, so after knight takes f6, queen takes f6 is playable. And you cannot take the bishop, you cannot take the queen. If you take the bishop, there's checkmate on a1. Well, taking the queen is illegal. So d4, breaking the communication. Black defends, once again. And now just knight f3. Black can exchange the bishop at some point, but we are left with a superior light-squared bishop either way, and the e5 square for the knight. So I think this is more promising for black than bishop e7, but I still think white should be fine. So bishop e7. Once again, knight e4, black castles. We go knight f3. Most people with black are going to play b6 and bishop b7. That makes most sense. Bishop b7, developing the bad French bishop. And now knight takes, bishop takes, and knight e5. So this is sort of the beginning of the Horwitz attack. And our idea will be to push our kingside pawns and overwhelm black on the king side. As you can see, many of our pieces are well placed for a kingside attack. So if black, continues c5, we can go f4. And eventually, moves like rook g1 and g4 are going to be possible. And the reason I really enjoy this variation is because it seems like a free attack. We haven't sacrificed any material, and I mean, g4 is coming at some point. You still have to be precise, of course. You cannot just push your pawns like a madman, but queen h5 could come, bishop d3 could come. I like this for white. The alternatives for black, if they don't take the pawn on e4, are knight f6 or c5. c5, as I said, is a normal French position. So what we're going to do here is we're not going to allow them a French position. So we take on d5. And after e takes d5, there is no French pawn center. We have liberated this bishop. That's the downside, of course, but our bishop is a monster too. So knight f3, knight f6, for example, bishop b5 check. If you play the Tarrasch, this sort of pattern should be familiar to you from the c5 Tarrasch French. Bishop d7, queen e2 check. And if black plays bishop e7, they are almost losing. They should go queen e7, and the queen trade is going to happen. Bishop e7 is just bad. I mean, this is dreadful. Just take on f6 because the bishop is pinned. Gf6 and now knight c3, and the d5 pawn is hanging. If you... I don't even know what to do for black. King f8 should be the best move. Maybe d4. I don't know. So yeah, bishop e7, not good. And knight f6 is, in my opinion, the most promising move for black because it provokes white to do something very radical. Now, black is threatening to take on e4 with the knight. And that's a big deal. That's something we simply cannot allow, because if we ever play f3, then queen h4 check is coming and g3 just loses because of knight takes g3. So we have to play e5. Now, this is bad for white for two reasons. I mean, not that the position is bad, but playing e5 is not something we want to do. Firstly, it blocks the bishop. Secondly, it allows black to have a French defense. So if black plays knight f6, they are almost guaranteed a French. However, we have a weapon against this. We now play a win-aware sort of pattern without having a knight on c3. So we go queen g4. And queen g4 is very dangerous. Black doesn't really have too many useful moves. The engine says black is fine, but after a move like bishop e7, we can take on g7, of course. And it's not easy to develop. If you go g6, trying to move your bishop, then f4. And let's say bishop e7 now, h4. And if you're brave enough to castle, then good luck to you. This isn't going to work. So black really should not be castling. On queen g4, black needs to complete their French setup, so c5. White continues f4. This is very, very standard. And we don't have a pawn on d4, so we don't have a weakness to defend, which is what we normally have to do in the French. So we can just continue playing normal moves without d4. In fact, we are going to go d3. Knight c6, normal French move. Knight f3. a6, b5 is one of black's plans. They don't have to do that, but it's one of the best. So b5 castles. And this is something you can expect from the knight f6 Horwitz attack. I really enjoy playing this with white because there are many ideas you could go for, especially if black castles. And if they don't, well, you know, then the king is stuck in the center and we can start opening up the position with h4, h5 anyway. The knight has g5. The bishop is kind of bad, that's true, but it won't be bad for long because we can move our queen, get the bishop to g4, maybe play g4, f5. It all depends on where the black king goes. If you turn on the engine, it's going to say equal, and it's going to say that black's best move is something like knight b4 or queen b6 or knight e7 coming into f5. The f5 square is something we have to fight over. And if black plays knight e7, I don't think knight h4 is too precise, even though we prevent f5, because we don't really want to take. The rook would come to g8. So instead of this, if they try to do that, just go queen h3 and prepare g4. You don't have to play it straight away, but you can play g4 at some point. It also allows you to play g4, f5, if necessary. So The Horwitz Attack is uncommon and it's really enjoyable for white. Worst case, you're going to be equal. Now, I'll show you what I've prepared. I've prepared 4 repertoires on noctie for each of the 4 variations we're going to be looking at today. You can play them against noctie, and that's the best way to learn not just openings, but any positions, middle game and end games. Other than playing an actual human and analyzing the games with him, playing a human-like AI is the best way to do that. It's much better than reading books, learning variations, or even watching videos. So what you can do is you can visit any of these repertoires. There are links below. Select, let's say the, I don't know, Bourdonnais Variation, and play against noctie. So you can select noctie's strength, the time format, your color. Noctie is going to play based on the moves I've imported up to a point. It's also going to try to deviate, and it's going to try to trick you. If you're better, it's going to play in a way a human would. So you can play games. If you decide to visit noctie and go premium to unlock all the features, use the code Hanging Pawns, which is going to give you a massive 64% discount, and then you can practice your anti-French setups. In this case, I'm playing the Bourdonnais. I'm not going to finish the game. I'll just show you what it looks like. Noctie is going to be giving you immediate feedback, and that's a great way to learn anything in chess. Okay, let's go back to the video. Okay, let's continue with the Chigorin variation, Queen e2. So Queen e2 prevents d5. It's as simple as that. If d5 is played, white is better, not winning or anything, but better, because after takes, queen takes, we get to play knight c3 with tempo, and we get a superior Scandinavian, because there's a pawn on e6. Normally in the Scandinavian, black wants to move this bishop out to f5 or to g4. So now you're stuck playing a Scandinavian in which your bishop is stuck on c8. And why would you want to do that? The engine says 0.5 for white. I think it's even more, firstly, because probably black doesn't know the Scandinavian, and even if they do, they aren't used to a Scandinavian with the bishop stuck on c8. So against Queen e2, the Chigorin, most people with black are going to play c5. There are 2 rare cases which black could play for, but I don't think this will ever happen on anything but the highest level. Black can play knight c6 and e5, or e5 and knight c6, they transpose. The idea is we get a double king's pawn opening where I'm a tempo down as black, but your queen is on e2. So let's say knight f3, knight c6, we get a normal sort of Spanish-Italian position, but you don't have bishop c4 or bishop b5. So black is saying this tempo isn't useful. However, white can play c3, white can play in sort of Ponziani fashion with the queen on e2, and I really enjoy this position with white. Why wouldn't I get a Ponziani with a queen on e2? My bishop can come out to g2 and I can quickly castle. So even though this is playable, I don't think many people are going to play e5, because if you play the French, you don't play e5. Even if you do play both, e5, unless you know it, seems very counterintuitive. So c5. Okay, now we got a sort of French position, French-Sicilian position, where white has played queen e2 in the Sicilian, and that's obviously not optimal, but again, we have a plan. This bishop is coming out to g2. We will not have to waste time. Also, we are preventing all d5 ideas, once again, because of the pin. So knight f3, and we are going to go g3, bishop g2. I should say that f4 is playable. Usually, as you're going to see in the Bourdonnais variation, f4 is not a good move because of d5. In most cases, in the Grand Prix, the McDonald attack, the Bourdonnais variation, but here, the e-pawn is pinned, so f4 is less risky, and you can go for that. I wouldn't recommend that you go for f4, but you can. This is the most aggressive way to play. So instead of f4, we play knight f3, g3, bishop g2. Black is going to play their normal French Sicilian, so g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, and knight g7. Black is playing for d5 or d6. And we basically have a closed Sicilian position where we haven't played knight c3. So instead of playing knight c3 and d3 and going into normal close Sicilian lines, which you could also call the King's Indian attack, if you go d3 and knight bd2, you're just playing a King's Indian attack. If you go knight c3, you could also call it the King's Indian attack. Instead of that, we're going to play a typical plan that works when you have delayed the development of the knight. We will play c3, knight a3, knight c2, and d4. This is our plan. We will have two knights and the c-pawn supporting d4. Enough firepower in most cases. If not, you can always go to d1. So c3, black probably castles, although other moves are possible. Now, playing d3 here is unnecessary. You can go d4 straight away, even though it's a temporary pawn sack, because after knight d4, bishop d4, there's rook d1 with compensation, and if you go bishop g7, then knight c3 and white is supposed to be fine. I don't think you should do that. Instead, you can go knight a3 or d3. So if knight a3, the problem is that maybe e5 can be played at some point. You face the same issue with d3 as well. But if black plays normal moves like d6, then knight c2, I don't know what to suggest. The only critical move is e5, but let's say queen c7, which doesn't do anything. We go d4. And now we have completed our strategic plan. If they do go e5, then I would recommend that you go d3 and play rook d1 and something like bishop e3, because the knight is not able to come out to g4, and slowly prepare d4. Since the center is sort of closed, apart from d5, you can also switch your attention to f4, and that's perfectly playable. Let's say a5, a4, black is going to play f5. That's their natural pawn break, and it's good to have the queen guarding the e-pawn, so we're a bit more flexible. We can take this, we don't have to, but taking on f5 is usually correct. I should also mention that if black plays a5 after a4, do not be afraid to switch plans and bring your knight to b5. This knight has just come from a3, I know, but since e5 has been played, blunting this bishop, I'm not really sure we have to play d4 or f4, bringing the bishop back to life. Maybe we can play strategically with the knight on b5. So the Chigorin variation is extremely interesting. There are two parts to this plan. The first part is knight f3, g3, bishop g2. The second part is c3, knight a3, knight c2, and then if black doesn't play e5, you play d4. If they do play e5, then, well, you adjust. You play d3, you castle, maybe play for f4, maybe play for knight b5. The next variation is c4, the Steiner variation, and this is probably the most aggressive one. Even though the Bourdonnais variation starts with f4, this is extremely aggressive. It's similar to the accelerated Panov. Imagine this pawn on c6 and this one back on e7. It leads to IQP positions. It's just that black is not playing the Caro-Kann, black is playing the French, so you're not trading a central pawn. You're trading a flank pawn in the Caro-Kann. So you could say that this is less good for black than the accelerated Panov. Let me just show you what I mean. So if c4, d5, takes. Black has traded the c-pawn for our e-pawn, and in the French, after e6, c4, d5, e takes, d5, takes. For example, black has traded the e-pawn, so this is less good positionally from a classical standpoint. So against c4, black of course does play d5, and you have two options. Either play e d5, transposing to the Monte Carlo variation of the exchange, so takes, and not taking. I just wanted to show you what happens in the accelerated Panov, but d4. This is the exchange variation. I don't want to look at this too much after something like knight f6, knight c3. It's a standard position. There isn't that much to be said about this. This pawn Imagine this pawn on e3, you get a normal Carlsbad, but now, since both bishops have the ability to come out, this is going to be an open game, very symmetrical, similar to the exchange. If black ever takes, of course, we're going to have an IQP position where white is fighting for the e5 square, trying to attack, black is trying to set up a blockade, and white is eventually perhaps able to play d5, liquidating the weakness. But we are going to focus on c takes. And after e takes, now we take once more. And this is the position we were looking at comparing to the accelerated Panov. And this is the proper Steiner variation. Once again, if you don't have d4 here, that's just, you're not transposing to the exchange French. At this point, after you've taken with the c pawn, you have to take. The alternative is e5, which I don't think is good. But okay, let's continue with this. E takes, e takes. Now, we have an isolated queen's pawn. Black will approach this position the same way they approach the accelerated Panov. They don't want to take with the queen, the same way you don't take with the queen in the accelerated Panov, because you lose a tempo to knight c3. And the upside to the Scandinavian, for example, is that your c2 pawn is not blocked, it has been traded off. So playing knight c3 comes with almost no downside. So black plays knight f6, attempting to recapture the pawn with the knight. Now, in the accelerated Panov, if I have to show you that position once more. So this position, knight f6, white has the option to play the move bishop b5, against which black should play knight b to d7, and white's going to be increasing the pressure. Black is going to be playing a6 and rook b8 and b5 and so on. There is no c pawn. In this case, in this position, the c pawn is still there, and our main move will once again be to play bishop b5, similar to what happens in the accelerated Panov. And even though the c pawn is on the board, it's not that great to move it. The engine says it's playable, I mean it's almost equal, but almost no one does that, because after takes, of course you don't want to take with the b pawn, you have to take with the knight. But now once you've taken with the knight, white plays knight f3 and immediately starts putting pressure on the knight on c6. There's queen a4. If white castles and plays rook e1 and knight e5 and queen a4, black could get overwhelmed. So against bishop b5, if you play the French, even though you still have the c pawn, do not play c6. The best move is knight bd7, the same way you respond to bishop b5 in the accelerated Panov. Okay, now knight c3, the c pawn is not blocked, that's fine. Bishop e7, knight f3, although you could go d4 instead. Our plan will be to play d4 anyway. Knight b6, black is going to take the pawn back. d4 or rook e1, both playable. You can also play with d3, but this is slightly more precise. And now black has a couple of options, but at some point they will recapture the pawn. One thing I should say is that we are never afraid of knight c3. We're afraid of knight c3 if our king is still on e1 and there's a bishop on b4, a known pattern from the Caro-Kann, the Panov in the Caro-Kann. In this case, we really don't care if white takes, if black takes. This is their blockading piece. In IQP positions, the side that's playing against the IQP wants to set up a firm blockade. You can see that there are no pawns on adjacent files, so this knight can never be driven away. Rook e1 developing, c6 chasing the bishop away, and there are many options here. I recommend the move bishop d3, although bishop c4 is also playable, but let's just stick to bishop d3 for now. Bishop g4, for example, h3, bishop h5. Bishop g4 is a good move for black because they get to guard this diagonal. If they don't, well, we know that in IQP positions, the side that has the IQP is trying to attack very quickly. So transferring this bishop to g4 before white prevents it is a good idea. Let me just give you an example. If black plays something like rook e8, by far the best move is h3. Now h7 will never be defended sufficiently. And knight g5 could come, knight e5 is definitely coming, the biggest outpost in IQP positions. f7 could be weak, which is, by the way, the reason you might want to keep the bishop on c4, so that you're looking at f7. So black really should go bishop g4 and get the bishop to safety on g6 and guard all the key squares f7 and h7. Now from here on, you have to choose a plan with white, and it's not really clear what white should do. It's clear that white should play dynamically, but you don't have that many options. What I like to do here is bishop g5. Now this move is very rare, it has never been played, but the idea is to eventually start taking things and weaken some squares. So for example, if rook e8, which is a pretty normal move, you can play a move like rook e5, you can play a move like g4, let's say g4, bishop g6, decline the trade, of course, we don't want to trade, bishop c4, and at some point, knight e5 could threaten to win this bishop. Let me just give you a weird example variation. Knight e5, I don't know, let's go rook c8, h4. White is already very close to winning, because if you play h6, then I take on g6, and you have to create the spin. So if h6, which is probably the only move, if you don't gain a tempo on the bishop or take on c3, eventually you will have to play h6. Then we take, f takes, bishop takes, this knight is pinned, so bishop takes, and now we just remove the defender of d5. Rook e8, queen e8, and you could throw in g5, you can also take on d5, you win a pawn, and white has a great position. So after bishop c4, black has to be very careful. We have the e5 square and we have h4, h5. So personally, I like playing the IQP from both sides, from both perspectives. I like to defend and I like to attack. So if you like playing the IQP, if against the Caro-Kann, for example, you play the Panov or the accelerated Panov, then this is the weapon for you. Finally, let's look at the least sound and most aggressive line, La Bourdonnais Variation. When I say least sound, it's minus 0.2 for black, it's nothing major. And black only has one way to punish this, and that's the immediate d5. If you are familiar with the McDonald attack in the Sicilian, you will know that after f4, black's main move is d5 once again. And this is the way to punish a premature f4. So of course, we don't want to take on d5, because then why did we play f4? So we have to advance. We also don't want to lose the pawn. So e5. And now we get this typical French structure in which we have to prepare d4. I think this is the biggest downside of this line. You don't have d4 straight away, you have to play c3. And once again, we are going to be applying the same plan, the same strategic plan we used in the Chigorin variation, except we're not going to be having a bishop on g2 in most cases, but we are going to play c3, knight a3, knight c2, and d4. And we are going to build our French center with the knight on c2, and the other knight will likely be on f3, also supporting d4. So knight f3, knight c6, black is just playing normal French moves, and black has a couple of options here. Black can play queen b6, which I don't think is a big deal. The two most common ways to play have the same idea behind them, getting to f5, and black is either going to go knight h6 or knight e7, getting the knight to f5. So let's just put knight h6 on the board. Knight a3, knight f5. Now we don't want to play g4, because our king will have no shelter. We are going to be castling kingside. So let's just continue with our plan. Bishop e7, d4. Goal accomplished. cd, cd. Queen b6 attacking d4 and b2. Now here I like to move bishop d3 because we're threatening to take on f5. And most people are going to allow white to take on f5. I should say the g6 is no good. G6 makes no sense. So black either leaves the knight on f5 and we take and they go ef, or they go knight h4. Now against knight h4, you don't have to take it, but I like taking, because after check g3, bishop e7, we can simply go rook b1, get this bishop out to e3, castle, and this structure may seem overextended, but f5 is actually pretty easy to play once you castle. So I like this. We are going to be playing for f5. And if they ignore this idea, if they play a move like bishop d7, then we take. And of course, this bishop has a bit more scope now. It's going to be sitting on e6 instead of d7, but who cares? I like this for white. We have given away our light squared bishop, but its counterpart really has to set up a blockade of the e5 pawn. So after something like castles, I don't know, rook c8, knight e3, for example, putting pressure on both pawns, and let's say queen d3. I mean, who wouldn't take white here? The engine says equal. It also says that this pawn does not have to be defended. You can defend tactically with queen a6. If you play a move like g6, then I believe white has an advantage. You can get away with bishop d2 because queen b2 runs into rook b1. And black's king is a bit unsafe now. So let's say we go bishop d2 and black castles, for example. Now we can go h3 g4. Again, it's very easy to undermine a static pawn structure, especially when your king is perfectly safe. If you are feeling unsafe, play king h2 and rook g1 and g4, but eventually g4 is coming. And this is a hook, which means that we can open up either the g file or both files. Let me just give you an example. By the way, the engine says equal if black plays h5 or f6. Let's just make nonsensical moves. g4. Now, one more nonsensical move. I'll show you what happens. So takes, and yeah, king h2. Good luck surviving this. I mean, the engine says +1. I think from a human perspective, it's way beyond +1 because white's moves are extremely easy. Double up the rooks and checkmate. Maybe sack on g4, or sorry, take on g4. Very, very easy. So the Bourdonnais variation, even if black does play perfectly, is close to equal, but I think white has better chances. So we have looked at 4 different weapons: b3, queen e2, c4, and f4. Let me know if you play one of them. Let me know if you're going to pick up one of them. Let me know what you struggle with most in the French. And also let me know which opening are you struggling with other than the French, because I'm going to be preparing these videos on weapons against certain openings for more openings. So comment below if there's a specific opening you would like me to cover. Thanks a lot and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.